Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Khaldun Ajari. I am the president of this club, and I have the honor to moderate this event today. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Gerhard Fassel. He is the CEO of Euro Technology Japan KK. It's a company now working in Japan. The topic of today is about corporate governance reforms in Japan. Sorry. Corporate governance reforms in Japan announced recently by the government of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. While many Japanese corporations are still admired around the world, some have been under the light of the media for some scandals or problems regarding the governors, and also regarding some products liabilities. So this has caused the confidence in Japanese corporations to decrease to some extent. And in this environment, Prime Minister Abe has headed reforms to try to make such improvement in the Japanese corporations that they can function outside in the world in a better way. And Dr. Gerhard Fassel, he's here today. He's one of those with a very good knowledge about Japanese corporations and about the reforms, and he will explain to us how these reforms can be succeeded to some extent, and what shall we expect from Japanese companies functioning outside in the outside world to have more and better communications with their counterparts in business. There's a good maybe image about Japanese governance by Japanese companies inside Japan, but when it comes to working overseas, the situation is different. And here, our speaker today, he has a year of experience in mergers and acquisitions, and also cross-border Japanese business development, and some projects in Tokyo. And he's well placed to explain what's happening inside Japan companies and what we might expect from Japan's corporate governance reforms. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest speaker today, Dr. Gerhard Fassel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. So my talk today is about corporate governance reforms in Japan, and I will cover essentially three topics. One is the background, why corporate governance is important, and one of the priority areas of Prime Minister Abe's reforms, economic reforms. The second point is, what is corporate governance? I'll talk a little bit about the basics of what corporate governance and corporate control, what that means. And then I'll talk a little bit out of my own experience. I'm for 4 years now, I'm outside independent director of a Japanese stock market listed corporation. So I've been doing corporate governance hands-on now for 4 years. And so I'll talk a bit about my own personal experience and views. What I can't do is I can't talk about the company where I'm board director. That I cannot. So here a little bit about my background. At the moment I'm doing several different things. I have a company called Euro Technology Japan, with which I founded about 20 years ago. And like our president said, we do mainly M&A. So, for example, we help the NTT's strategy. We worked with a global M&A team of NTT on the strategy for Europe. Or recently, we helped a French pharmaceutical company acquire a pharmaceutical factory here in Japan. Or we're working with quite a few medical startups, medical technology startups now. And then since for 4 years, I'm board director, and since last year also a member of the supervisory and audit committee of a Japanese stock market listed company. The market value is roughly $200 or $300 million, so it's quite a substantial company. And then since last year, I'm also guest professor at Kyushu University, developing 4 projects there in Kyushu. So this is a picture which kind of gives an idea of my DNA. So I worked a long time in physics research on semiconductors, and on the left here you see a picture of Trinity College, Cambridge, where I did my PhD in physics. So in the middle you can see me here. Later I was faculty member in Cambridge doing research on optics, so you can see me here in a laser lab, which was my laser lab. And then also my great-grandfather is one of the biggest physicists ever. So his name is Ludwig Boltzmann. So I'm developing a leadership forum now where I invite Nobel Prize winners and corporate leaders to discuss things how to improve things. Now, why is corporate governance important? When I was discussing with the vice president of Kyushu University, Kyushu University was telling me various information to make Kyushu attractive. And so I looked into the details, and I found that when you look at the economic data since 1960s, then Kyushu and Holland were growing about with a similar pace between 1960 and the year 2000. And today, Kyushu's economy is roughly the same size as it was in the year 2000. Whereas in the case of Holland, today the economy is about twice the size of Kyushu. And the same, you can make many other comparisons like that involving Japan. You can compare Japan with similar countries in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and you will always find similar curves. And this is one of the issues which has driven Prime Minister Abe to come up with a reform program. And corporate governance is one of the major components of this reform program. So of course there are several different factors behind economic growth. One is the population issue, which we are not talking about here now. But the other point is corporate governance, is how to make companies more successful. So you need to create ventures, but ventures is only one side of the story. You also need to make the existing established companies more successful. So Japan needs healthy companies. So if you kind of rank the companies, you have the superstars which are admired globally, like SoftBank, for example. Then you have a second league, which is very large, which has no growth and no profits. And an example is the whole electronics sector. So if you add up all the electronics companies in Japan, Toshiba, Hitachi, Fujitsu, Sony, and so on, these companies, if you add up the sales, they're about the same size as Holland. But opposite to Holland, for about 20 years, these companies didn't show any profits and didn't grow. And so corporate governance is one of the issues which need to be changed to help these companies revive again. Then you have a third league of companies like Sharp, which went into trouble because of management decisions. So in my view, the major problem Sharp did is they built this huge liquid crystal display factory in Sakai, and they funded it with bank loans and not with equity. So in the case of bank loans, the company has the risk, whereas in the case of equity, the shareholders have the risk. In addition to the company, of course. So if Sharp would have built this liquid crystal factory in Sakai with equity raised capital, stock exchange raised capital, I don't think they would have had to have run into these existential problems, which they did. But since they financed with bank loans, these bank loans became payable, I think, 2 years ago, and at that point they had to sell the majority of shares to Hunhai. And now, why is this important in the context of corporate governance? The reason is that I don't have the data of what was discussed at the board meetings, but essentially the board directors at that time would have had the duty to analyze this investment into this liquid crystal factory and weigh the pluses and minuses of debt versus equity, and possibly maybe this hasn't been done properly. And then you have the fourth league of companies, which are those which in the case of Sharp, it was a bad management decision, or a management decision which turned out to, in the long run, to be defective. But it was not a criminal issue, as far as I know. But in the fourth league, you have the more serious problems, which is, the Toshiba and Takata and a long list of companies. Now, often this is framed as a problem of Japan, and people say, "Oh, what is wrong with Japanese companies?" And I object to that view. In my view, I think these problems are not specific to Japan, they are specific to these particular companies. So Japan, I think, has many fantastic companies like SoftBank and many others, and on the other hand, they have problem companies, but so has any other country. So I don't want to name any names, but I'm sure you know about a certain German car company which is always in the headlines over the last 5 years or 7 years. And in US also you can find many companies who do things wrong. And so it's not, Japan doesn't have a monopoly on these corporate problems. Okay, so electronic sector, I just want to remind you that Japan has 8 huge electronics conglomerates. If you add up their sales, they are about as big as Holland, but the overall sales of this electronics company is about $600 billion, so it's very, very large. And as you can see here on the left, for 20 years approximately, they had zero growth, no growth at all. And if you average out their profits over 20 years, then you get a negative number. So the Japanese electronics sector, if you average out over 20 years, you have no growth and no profits. And that, of course, if you want to improve the economic growth in Japan, you do need to take care of improving how these very large established companies are managed. And that's one of the major issues behind which drives the government to push corporate governance improvements. Now, the former CEO of Tokyo Stock Exchange, Atsushi Saito, he's now the chairman of KKR here in Japan. He gave a talk here a couple of years ago, and he said that he was one of the drivers behind Japan's corporate governance reforms. And he, here in this press club, he stated that the Japanese corporate governance reforms have happened much faster than he has been imagining in his wildest dreams. So he was very surprised how fast the government reforms have been executed here. I have a friend who is quite high in the Ministry of Finance, and she told me that the Ministry of Finance is super happy with corporate governance reforms, and the answer is, so I asked her why, and she said because it doesn't cost anything. The Ministry of Finance, most of the economic measures here, like building bridges and subsidizing research, all of that costs money. And so the Ministry of Finance prefers not to spend money. So they love corporate governance reforms, because if they improve the profits of companies, they improve the tax revenue. So if the corporate governance reforms are successful, then the Ministry of Finance will earn more tax. And it doesn't cost anything, because corporate governance reforms consist of changing rules and changing mindsets. But the Ministry of Finance doesn't have to invest anything, except maybe for some conferences or so, but no real money. So they love it. Okay, there's a global evolution in the thinking about corporate governance. The kind of stereotype view was that in the past it was a ceremonial boards, corporate boards were like an honorary distinction, an old boys club in the sense of being old men only. And that is the past. And then you had a transition to the monitoring functions, which focused on the defensive functions and compliance. But I think more recently the focus is on leadership. So how to lead companies and how to create new growth. in addition to the purely defensive monitoring and checking functions. Now, if you look a bit at the theoretical base behind corporate governance, there's a lot of discussion, and one view which is especially driven in Anglo-Saxon countries and by activist investors is the emphasis on shareholder value. And this discussion usually, one of the foundations to these discussions is the so-called agency theory. So agency theory means that when you have situations where, for example, shareholders invest in a fund, and then this fund is governed by managers who are on a salary, then the managers in their daily work, they take decisions about money which is not their own. So they act as agents of the principal. So there is a conflict, there can potentially be a conflict of interest between the agents and the principal. And this agency principle analysis is usually used by activist hedge funds to emphasize the importance of shareholder value. And a different view on corporate governance is the view which is maybe more common in Japan, is where you look at internal governance. So, for example, where the CEO would be checked by the other members of the company and the customers and the stakeholders. And the responsibility in such internal governance picture, the responsibility of the top management, the executives and the CEO is more seen to be to the internally, to the staff of the company and the stakeholders in the company. So you have these two quite opposite views. And internal governance is quite important when you try to understand how Japanese companies work. But it's not a purely Japanese theory. So, for example, one of the very important works in this field is analysis by Professor Acharya and Myers and Rajan, who are Acharya is at New York University, Myers is at MIT, and Rajan is at Booth Business School in Chicago. And they have written important work on the internal governance of firms, where they discuss this internal governance. And these two opposite views really came to a clash when about 10 years ago you had a number of activist investment funds coming into Japan, and essentially all of them failed. So you will remember the Children's Fund who tried to take influence on J-Power, and also the Chubu Denryoku, and there are some other cases. And in most of these cases, the foreign funds didn't achieve much, and in most cases quit Japan. And the situation you had here is that you had Japanese companies which were governed by this internal governance. The top management, the board of directors and the executives were really very much looking inside the company for guidance and control. Whereas the activist investor funds, in some cases quite noisily, they emphasized the agency theory viewpoints and the shareholder value viewpoints, and that was often interpreted on the Japanese side by short-term thinking, which it probably is. So in most countries, the leadership structure of companies is such that you have, of course, the shareholder meeting, the shareholders, at least theoretically, at the top. And the shareholder meeting usually have the power to vote against resolutions in the shareholder meeting. And in the larger shareholders, institutional shareholders, at least in Western countries, usually can meet with the top management, with the CEO, and discuss directly with the CEO. But apart from this kind of not very strong influence, all the shareholders can do is sell the shares. And if there are enough of those shareholders which sell the shares, then the share price will go down. So that the influence of the shareholders is pretty indirect. So in most countries in Europe and also in the US, you have a supervisory board and then a separate executive management board. And the supervisory board usually has the powers to fire the CEO, for example. Now, traditionally in Japan, until maybe 2-3 years ago, you had a single board of directors, which is usually composed only of homegrown executives, and then there will be a CEO. In some cases, also a chairman. You have the shareholder meeting. The shareholder meeting approves the directors. So, in theory, the shareholder meeting can oppose the election of directors, and in rare cases that happens. Then in the traditional Japanese structure, you had an audit board which was appointed by the CEO. So the audit board, also nominally independent, depended on the appointment by the CEO. And then in many cases, or in some cases, you have unofficial people involved in the management, which are like retired chairmen, and in most cases, probably these are very, very good people with long experience and the right business instincts. But in some cases, when people age like wine, people age differently. Some people age, you have some divergence of ability at age. Okay, so there were reforms, and there are essentially four streams of reforms. One very important law is the company law, the Kaisha-ho, which is the basis for how companies are managed and set up in Japan. That was reformed. Then corporate governance code was first issued by the Tokyo Stock Exchange in June 2015. And that corporate governance code is not law, and the companies are not obliged to follow, but the companies need to either oblige or explain. So if a company does not follow the corporate governance code or some parts of the corporate governance code, the companies need to explain to the stock exchange why they don't comply. And companies also have to submit reports on their corporate governance situation to the to the Tokyo Stock Exchange. And Tokyo Stock Exchange summarizes all these. There are 3,500 companies on the stock exchanges here in Japan. Most of them all of them are essentially on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So the Tokyo Stock Exchange issues a report on the progress of corporate governance reforms in these 3,500 companies. And in the latest reports, about 90% of the companies largely conform to the code. So the progress of the compliance to the code is actually pretty good now. Then there's a third stream, which is the stewardship code, which is issued by the Japan's Financial Services Agency, and which addresses the duties of the fund managers, and how they should manage stock holdings. And then the fourth stream, of course, is the mindset, is the decision of courts and customs and more soft reforms. And all of these four streams are important and have changed quite rapidly. Now, the Stock Exchange Corporate Governance Code says that corporate governance means a structure for transparent, fair, timely, and decisive decision-making by companies with due attention to the needs and perspectives of shareholders and also customers, employees, and local communities. So, in the words of the Stock Exchange, corporate governance means to take care of all the stakeholders. My own thinking is what I would add to this. It also means leadership. It means looking into the future and inspiring the teams. I think that's probably one of the most important factors. Okay, as a function of these corporate governance reforms, the way how Japanese corporations can be and must be set up has been changed. In the past, I showed you in the past there was only this single structure as shown on the right, there's some modification to this, but there was actually audit committee was introduced 10 years ago. So, but I won't discuss that now. Okay, so now companies have to choose between 3 different ways of being set up. One is the tradition, more or less the traditional way of a company with Kansayaku board. The second one is a company with 3 committees. These 3 committees are nomination committee, audit committee, and remuneration committee. And if a company chooses that shape, then they also have to have an executive board, which is supervised by the board of directors, by the Kansayaku. Not Kansayaku, by the Torishimari Yakai. And the third type of company is a company with a supervisory committee and audit committee, which is one. It's supervisory and audit committee with one committee. And so the company where I'm board director is this third. And the second type with the 3 committees is mostly for very large corporations like Toshiba, Hitachi, Sony. They have this shape. All the very large companies usually have that shape. But overall, the majority of companies, I think 80%, have this first type. And my direct personal experience is with the third type. Okay, so I'm showing the one with supervisory committees is the one, the shape of the company which where I'm board director now. And then the second part of the slide here on the right-hand side shows the case of company with 3 committees, which is for large corporations. And then the majority of companies have a third type, which is with a audit committee, which I haven't shown here, but it looks similar. Structure looks similar as the one on the left here. Now, as you can see here, about 80% of the companies have this Kansayaku board, which is the traditional shape, and about 20% have the company with supervisory committee, which is the company which I have my 4 years of experience now, and then a small, maybe 7% of all public companies, about 2% of the companies have this 3 committee shape. But these are the top sized companies, large companies. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about my own experience. What does a company director do and why? So what is the company director's primary responsibility and where is the loyalty? And I've asked people from big investment houses who talk about how terrible Japanese governance is in Japan and so on. So I tell them, do you know what corporate governance is? Do you know what a board director's job is? And it's not so simple. So I met many people who don't know what a board director's duty really is. And the standard reply is usually to take care of the shareholders. It's usually the standard reply from people in the financial industry. And as I explained before, and also my personal view is, of course, shareholders are very important, but it's only one of several duties. It's only one. According to the company law, the board directors shall perform the following duties. They have to decide the execution of the operations of the company with the board of directors. So the board of directors votes and discusses all the major decisions in the companies, in the particular company. And usually there's a threshold, so it's something like 5 million yen or 10 million yen or 1 million yen, depending on the size of the company. And if the impact of a decision is larger than this limit, then it will automatically must go to the board of directors. There's a discussion and there's a vote. And then in some cases, there can be a vivid discussion, and then the decision could be postponed, for example. So secondly, the duty of the board of directors is to supervise the execution of the duties by the board of directors. Now, the problem is that in most cases, like I've shown you, in like 90% of the cases, or 98% of the cases, most of the people on the board of directors of Japanese companies are at the same time executives in the company. So essentially, they supervise themselves. And for that purpose, the system of outside directors was introduced. And for 4 years now, I've been outside director. So I wasn't executive in the company, but outside director. And then the third duty is to appoint and remove the representative director or directors. And as you know, Japanese companies don't have this CEO, CFO, CTO structure, but the way it works here by law is there's a board of directors, and then you can have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 daihyo torishimaryaku, which are the representatives. And then there's this title of shacho, and some companies have kaicho, but they don't have to have. So the actual way, so if you have a Western picture in your mind, CEO, CFO, and so on, then that doesn't transform one-to-one on how Japanese companies are organized. So you can have more than one representative directors, and they can be that representative function can be taken away by the board of directors. But the board of directors cannot appoint or fire directors. That is done by the shareholder meeting. So that's how it works. Okay, so according to the governance code, the boards, this was here the company law. So this is law of the land, passed by the parliament. Then this page shows points which are not law, but they are issued by their rules by the Tokyo Stock Exchange and are not compulsory. So if companies don't follow these rules, they have to explain, but they are not forced to. So the corporate governance code says that the board's duties include setting the broad direction of corporate strategy. So looking ahead, where should the company go? Which fields should we enter, and where should we reduce our activities, for example? They should support appropriate risk-taking. So the board should encourage risky investments in new technologies or acquisitions which have a good chance of succeeding, but where there's some risk. So corporate governance does not mean that there should be no risk taken. And they should oversee the directors and management. And in that case, again, in most cases here, most of the board members in traditional companies are the executives supervise themselves on the board. And that is not the case in, for example, the large corporations. It's 2% of all companies which have a split Torishimakai and Shikoyaku Inkai. So, for example, Hitachi has a majority of outside directors on the board, and then they have a board of executives. So there are some of the largest Japanese companies don't have this issue. Okay, so my own approach is, I studied the laws. I spent when I started, I spent about half of my time for half a year studying the law, reading the laws, reading all sorts of papers about corporate governance. I have to understand the company. I have to understand the industry, the competitors, the industry trends, the technologies. I have to understand what makes the company successful. I developed an agenda. And then I push that agenda. So I have an agenda, I want certain things to be done, and then I push. And I don't do that only at the board of directors, but also in dinners and one-to-one meetings with the CEO and other board directors. So I use a lot of social interactions in order to push my thoughts and my agenda. So the sixth point is I need the buy-in. As a board director, you're not the CEO. A CEO can order people to do things, but as a board director, you cannot order anybody anything. You can vote against decisions. You can, most of your power is really soft power, convincing other people and get majorities. Okay? Recently, there's a lot of good developments. So I just listed some of the very nice developments now. There are foreigners on boards in Japan, but only 0.7% of all board directors are foreigners. So I think one thing which is really necessary is to change mindsets to get changes. And one picture I often show, this is from the website of an organization called Women Act, and it says here, step by step women are becoming main players. And then you have a list of, so I give you a good homework here to spot the woman on this webpage. And when I show this to Japanese people, many of my Japanese friends, they really get enraged when they see this picture. I don't know if it's still up on the website, but it was last time I looked. Or this is a picture I took from a TV screen where, this television commentator explains the new economic strategy of the third arrow of Abe. And then it shows, how these third arrows are going to be executed. And if you look at these faces again, please try to spot the woman here. There's none, So and actually nobody, when most people, when they see that here, the traditional people, they don't even think this is funny or this is, So I think, women on board seats. I looked at this corporate governance reform report of the Tokyo Stock Exchange, which is actually, it's kind of machine prepared. It's not a very thorough report, but in that report it says that 7% of listed companies say that they have appointed at least one executive officer, not board director, but executive officer. So what this means when you take that literally, it means that 7% of these 3,500 Japanese listed companies have appointed at least one woman executive officer. So this is a super small number. I mean, extra super small number. But this is not a scientific study. It's a kind of computer-generated review. It's not a very good study, but it's kind of the best number I found in my quick search for that. So this is almost zero, but on the other hand, I do know recently, like there's a company called Wantedly, which had IPO in September, and which is worth now $300 million roughly. And the CEO is I think 32-year-old lady called Naka, and she's CEO of a company she founded on the stock exchange first section. I'm not sure which section, but the market value is $300 million. So it's not the numbers which count; it's the quality. And I mean that lady is really outstanding. So my message today is really, if Japan wants to restart growth, several change of directions have to occur. And one of them is definitely changing mindsets and changing corporate governance. There's more global leadership needed. The global leadership, which means diverse people on the boards, is still very, very low. It's starting now, and there's a trend, but it hasn't picked up really yet. The corporate leadership needs long-term vision, broad range of knowledge, strategies, but overall, I think corporate governance reforms are happening faster than expected in Japan. I mean, one last point is maybe that for the global leadership, the language is a big issue. So the number of foreigners on boards in Japan is very low, and one factor is really this is language. So you have to, if you're a foreigner on the board of a Japanese corporation, if you want to be effective, it can only be in Japanese. There's no other way, So I should also add that at the end, that all this work I do at the board of this company is 100% in Japanese. All the paper, my discussions to convince people, all of that is in Japanese. So there's no headphone here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentations and giving us more light, spreading more light about the Japanese companies. We'd like to open the floor to your questions, and please, if you have a question, raise your hand and proceed to the front mic here.
And they should tell their affiliation or name.
Yeah, of course, they will do that, yes. All right, the first question. Yes, please. Please tell your affiliation first. After.
Michael Stott from the Nikkei Asian Review. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I'm just trying to make the connection between corporate governance and growth, and wanted to ask you which parts of corporate governance you think are most critical for growth in Japan, because some of the things that you rightly criticize about Japanese corporate governance have been features of American companies too, perhaps.
Of course.
And yet they've managed to grow. So
Yes.
what's the sort of connection there between the growth and the governance that you see more specifically?
Okay, yeah, this is of course a case-by-case issue, and every company is different, yeah. But one particular factor where Japan has been very slow, for example, compared to Germany, is globalization. Like there are many Japanese companies who have excellent technology, and there are studies comparing, for example, German mid-sized companies and Japanese mid-sized companies. And these studies show that German mid-sized companies are much better at globalizing, much better than Japanese corporations. And corporate governance plays a role here, because recently I gave a similar talk in Berlin at one of the business schools in the center of Berlin. And there was an Indian master student there who had previously worked in a consulting company, who was consulting one of the large, I won't say the name, but one of the large Japanese corporations in India. And there were Japanese corporate executives sent to India who knew nothing about India, were eating separately, weren't eating with the staff, had 100 times higher salary than the local staff, and were completely disconnected from the Indian situation. And so if you do a Google search, you will find out that there is a very large Japanese corporation involved in lawsuits in India now. And this same corporation essentially failed in almost all the foreign ventures. But inside Japan, it's one of the top companies, and was driving technology, still driving technology. And so I think this global factor is one issue, but not every company needs to be global. So there are some, also in US or in Europe, there are some companies which are very successful locally. And so another factor, so in order to manage your globalization, you need people at the top level who have the in-depth know-how and the social networks and the understanding. So you need that. Then the other thing is you need to have more diverse experience. So in my understanding of Sharp, for example, Sharp essentially failed and then was rescued by Hunhai. And that failure, I think, as I mentioned in the talk, was because of, I think, lack of financial knowledge at the top. And as I said, Japanese companies don't have this traditional Western structure of CTO, CFO, human resources. So often you have a board, in some cases you have boards who are all engineers. There's like the factory chief becomes the board member. And so this person is very super good at building and running liquid crystal display factories. But he doesn't see the bigger picture. Maybe he doesn't see that there are OLEDs, organic competitors coming, because he comes from that factory, he will defend that factory. So I think an outside viewpoint, independent big picture viewpoint is very, very important.
Thank you. Yes, next question. Yes, please.
I'm not pressed, but
it's okay.
Thank you. My name is Peter van den Berg. I'm with the Netherlands Embassy, so I was happily surprised by the first part of your presentation. My question also taps into the globalization aspect because it taps into the kind of measures that the government can take to stimulate this entire development. Because you touched upon the rules and regulations that the government came up with, and the fact that a lot of Japanese companies don't globalize as much as they perhaps could. Do you think there's also a role for the government to stimulate the opposite direction, instead of stimulating Japanese companies to go abroad, to increase the involvement of foreign companies in this country? Because the reason I'm asking is that if I look at the Dutch companies in Japan, their presence here is very limited. Japan is still the third economy in the world, and it is our 21st trading partner. So those are really strange numbers. So could you comment on that?
Okay, that's a very good point. Actually, I had a slide here, I left it out to save time, but it's good that you come up. I think there are several issues again. It's a complex issue. No? I mean, one point is that in terms of value, if you take all of Europe, since Holland is a European company, about half of all European business in Japan failed in terms of cash value. And the reason why this is because so many big corporations failed here. And that is also related to corporate governance. And the biggest one of all is Vodafone. And Vodafone is so big that if Vodafone would have succeeded in Japan, European investment in Japan would be twice as high as it is now. So European investment in Japan, the investment stock, is approximately 100 billion euro, roughly 100 billion. And if Vodafone would have succeeded in Japan, it would be also worth about 80 to 100 billion dollars. So European investment in Japan would be twice as high. So one part of the answer to your question is we have to increase the success ratio of foreign companies in Japan. And that means it's a corporate governance issue. Since this is one of the focus points of my own company, I spend enormous amount of energy in that, and also work. It's part of our work. All too often, you have foreign management coming in here who doesn't know enough about Japan, and then they take decisions which are not based on the realities of Japan, but there's this opinion. They say, we've succeeded in 100 companies, so I can't see why Japan should be so special. We will do it the same as we do everywhere else. Or they put their Asian headquarters in Singapore, and then which is about the size of Yokohama, and it's about the same distance more or less to Europe. Singapore to Europe and Singapore to Japan and Europe to Japan. The whole travel both takes a day of travel. It's about the same in terms of travel time. And so I think if I haven't looked now specifically in Holland, but I can give you a long list of foreign companies which have failed here, and especially European ones. And I think to improve the presence of European companies in Europe, the one thing which needs to be done is to improve the success ratio. That's one point. The second point is that with my advisory company, we work a lot with mainly European, but also American companies and Australian companies building up Japan business. And also often companies come to us, and like one of the most famous European companies, I can't say the name, but they came last year, they came to us, and we worked with their top 35 executives. And we had a couple months project, and this company had been here for 30 years, and their business potential in Japan is about $1 billion, but at the moment they have about 50 million sales, and they've been here for 30 years. And so they gave us a project and said, Gerhard, tell us what can we do to finally take off. So we had like a couple months project, and then we made a workshop for the top 35 CEO, CFO, and the top 3 are all McKinsey guys. So they're all super bright. One was hired from Google. They're all super bright guys. And I started by making a test on them. I gave them a test with very simple questions about Japan, and they had about 80% wrong and 20% right. And so I said, look, you guys, you want to take decisions about Japan, but you don't know enough about Japan. And so I think you need to increase the knowledge in Holland about Japan at senior levels. The thing is, the people who I deal a lot with, top management of big corporations. Top managers of big corporations are not, not virgins. They are strong people. I mean, you don't become head of a large corporate. You don't get to the top of a large corporation if you're not really strong and you have lots of victories under your belt. And not in all cases, but in some cases, that leads to a blossoming ego development. And then it's hard for these type of people. At the top level, you have very modest, very listening type of people, but some of them don't listen to anybody. And for these people, it's hard to realize that they should study about Japan. They come in and they think, oh, everybody's stupid here, and that usually doesn't work. So these are maybe the two most important answers. There are many more things to say, but...
Yes, more questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. And Gerhard-san, good to see you. And my question, I used to work for...
Your name, please.
And also in the legal and regulatory department, as well as I used to work for Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Japan-EU FTA negotiations. So my question relates to, you have your agenda. I think it's lifelong agenda to change mindset. And you've been working for both European side and for Japan, and trying to open the markets and enhance the free competition. And so my question relates to changing mindset. For Japan, the challenge is basically to overcome, because this is a societal problem from bottom to up, fear of change. Fear of new things, innovation, and to fail. That how do you maybe based on your previous experiences, how did you overcome one person or one company's mindset to convince them to overcome that fear of change or fear of newness?
Your name, please.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm a colleague from sort of university network with Gerhard-san, and my name is Fujiko Amano. I'm a lawyer, newly qualified.
Thank you.
And what is your position now? Maybe you should
yes,
say.
Actually, I used to work for a U.S. Law firm called Sidley Austin, but I now lead legal department in Japanese operations called Rimini Street. It's a U.S. software maintenance company.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, the mindset. This is the most important thing. It's the most hard. I mentioned before my friend at the Ministry of Finance who was saying that, the corporate governance is so nice because it doesn't cost anything. And she was also saying the number one issue is changing the mindsets concerning women issues as well as many other things. I mean, my own thing is it's case by case. Some people don't want to listen, then you can't do anything, But in the case of people listen, I mean, when we do this, what I've done a couple of times now is doing for European companies regarding Japan is to make quiz for them. I make it like a game. I say, okay, your job is to take decisions about Japan, and do you want to have a quiz? Do you want to take the challenge of how much you know about Japan? And then I have a quiz for them. Yeah? But then, I mean, as a leader, you have to lead by example. You have to do yourself. I mean, there's no point to tell people what to do if you don't do it yourself. In English, you usually say you have to walk the walk. No? I mean, myself, I take huge risks all the time. I used to have a permanent position at Cambridge University. I could have stayed there forever. I could still be there, and I don't know how my career would have developed then, But I just jumped and, so I just jump into new things all the time. And how to change other people's mindsets by events like today, by by doing. The best thing is doing, but then also by talking to people. And I mean, most of the talking I do is internal, like on the board where now I'm building 4 projects in Kyushu, so I'm guest professor there, and I'll tell you another time what I do there.
First, thank you very much for the great presentation, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm Nao Makino from Misaki Capital, an investment fund. You have been outside director of GMO Cloud for nearly 4 years, but this company is known as the parent subsidiary listed structure.
Yes,
in Japanese, Oyako Jojo, and there should be some problem of conflict of interest, as you may of course know. So my question is, I'm not asking a specific question of this company, but in general, what's your view on this kind of listed structure, and how do you manage to prevent the conflict of interest as outside directors? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have told you at the beginning, I cannot talk about this company. I can talk about everything else, but not GMO Cloud. That is not possible. I can talk in general. Let me think in general. There are many companies like NEC and NEC Electronics or Hitachi. They have many subsidiaries which are separately listed. And this type of structure has some problems, but so has any other situation. For example, when the president of the Tokyo Stock Exchange, former president Saito-san, was giving the talk here, he was also asked about this and related problems. And his reply was that the worst offender in this area is US with these AB shares, Facebook and Google. Many of the Silicon Valley companies have shares which have different rights attached. And yes, I remember now, the question which was asked to Saito-san was concerning a share issue by Toyota, which had different rights attached to the shares. So I think every country has its own issues. And I think this issue that you have a company where its subsidiary is separately on the stock exchange, I think that is very uncommon outside Japan. And if that would be the case, I don't know if, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know if it's legally possible. There might even be laws against it in certain countries. But even if if it would be done in Europe or in US, then there would be a large, share price discount, usually. And my guess is that could be the case in Japan also. So my guess is like, if you take like NEC Electronics, if NEC would sell all the shares and NEC Electronics would become independent, then the share price would probably be higher, maybe, I don't know, if the management becomes better also. So.
Thank you. Yes. Let me ask this question.
Yes.
You talked about the rate of women in the governance and on the boards. I listened once to Carlos Ghosn. He's CEO of Nissan in Japan, and at that time there was a lot of talk about women taking leading roles. And he said it's not the case for us to put percentage and just fill it with ladies, because we need somebody on the board and in the governance room that is qualified to lead. It's not just because of their gender. And I know that in Japanese offices and even industry, there are a lot of women working on the ground level, and so they have really a lot of importance.
Yes.
I'm sure most of their experience is funneled to the leadership, and it's taken care of.
Yes.
So is this really a serious problem in Japan, the rate of women in the leadership level?
Okay. I think I can answer maybe three or four points to that. I mean, one issue is that if the current trend continues, there won't be any Japanese people around anymore in a couple of years. Yeah, so Japanese women are voting with their feet, literally speaking. In that there's not many kids being born. Yeah, and so that's you can measure. Yeah, you can see that. Whereas in Europe, it's quite possible for a professional woman to have 4 or 5 kids, because the society is so set up. And there was actually a couple of days ago was the Women's Day, and I watched on YouTube. There's a lady called what's her name? Fogherini, I think. She's something like the foreign minister of the European Union. I forgot the name now. Fogherini or so. And sorry. Mogherini, and she was asked, what do you think is the most important thing to do for women's the gender issues? Yeah, and she said the number one issue is to have father's maternity leave, men's maternity leave. She said that's the most important thing, because if men take the same amount of free time after childbirth, then this employment issue falls away. This employment difference falls away. That's what she said. Okay, concerning Carlos Ghosn, I was at the talk here also at this conference, and he said one more thing which was quite funny. I think everybody laughed. He was asked the question, Carlos Ghosn, you only say that you are aspiring to have, I think, 3% women at top levels by the year 2000.
7 to 8 it was.
7 to 8, okay. 7 to 8. But he said that the Prime Minister Abe set a target of, 20%. And why? 30%. Okay, 30%. You have much better memory than I have. 30%. So the question was to Carlos Ghosn, why is your aspiration so much lower than Prime Minister Abe's? And his answer was that his contract as a director, as a CEO, was just prolonged. So in the year 2000, he will still be CEO. So, and he is usually binds himself by his commitments. So he says, if he says 7%, then he is obliged to fulfill. But in the case of a politician, that is not the case. That was what he said.
May I add something?
Yes.
Just
Please come
at the time of that talk by Mr. Ghosn, the percentage was 7% at.
Please repeat for the record.
Sorry. Kurt Sieber, associate member. Yeah, at that time, Nissan had 7% in female executives, or managers. I mean, section chief and so on up. And he said their target is, and as you correctly pointed out, we need people who are qualified. We cannot hire them just because they are gender. Well, they're women. We are not going for gender equality. We are going to get the best people for each job, which is quite normal for the president. He also said that their present plan, all the same, was to increase it within 3 years from 7 to 10%. And somebody then said, "But what do you think of the target of 30% by Mr. Abe?" And said, "Well, he is very, very ambitious." And as you know, later on it was reduced to 15%, and in the government I think it's now about 4%, and in the diet is about how much? 15%?
Yeah, in the diet, that's a big problem. I mean, in
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in Europe, in most countries, you have at least 50% women in the parliament, and so, for example, one thing they did in the Danish parliament is they decided not to take any votes after 4 p.m. So to give people the possibility to go home at 4.
Thank you. Yes. Let me follow up. You mentioned the shrinking labor force in Japan. How is that affecting the corporate governance, if any?
Shrinking labor force, corporate governance. Okay. Well, if you only look at the company and not the general society, now then you only look at the particular company. At the company level, it becomes a competitive issue. Yeah. So it means it's harder for you to attract the suitable people you need, and so in a company you have different types of people. You have top producers, software engineers and leaders at the top, and then you have like more auxiliary people, like people in doing accounting or doing call center. Okay, so these are two very different areas. At the top producer level, at the moment in Japan, the salaries are fairly low. So I think you'll have a more competitive environment developing and getting stricter there. And so the labor market there will adjust. And at the top level, it's not really a labor market. It's a kind of headhunting type issue. No? At the lower level, I think artificial intelligence will come in, and that is already happening. That like the commodity type of functions will be more and more replaced by flying automatic helicopters with artificial intelligence and so on. So instead of having somebody ticking the boxes in the warehouse, you'll have drones flying around and taking note of the incoming and outgoing goods and so on, I think. And corporate governance role is really to see that this change and these reactions is well executed, well done, and well planned ahead.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm not sure we expect a robot in the room of the board of any company soon, but until that time, I'd like to we'll just wait and see. And I extend to you, thank you for coming today. I extend to you 1 year honorary membership to our club.
Thank you.
Please come again. And, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.